Welcome to Unit 14 of the TESOL course at Southern Utah University. In this video, we'll be focusing on describing language proficiency. We'll talk about why we need language proficiency descriptors, and then we'll look at the three most commonly used scales, the CEFR, the ACTFL, and the CLB. So why do we need these scales? There's lots of reasons, but it relates mostly to teachers, students, and then other stakeholders. So let's talk about teachers first. Teachers need to know what skills to target for their students. So when they have a proficiency scale that tells them this is the general language ability of your student, so these are the kinds of things you can target, these are the skills you should work on, then it helps teachers choose things that are appropriate, that are not too high or too low for their learners. It also helps the learners take more ownership of their language learning because they can see what they need to do to show proficiency at a particular level. It also helps them when they take a look at the whole system and they say, up here is where I want to be, and I'm here down here, so these are the foundational skills I need to develop before I'm ready to develop the skills that are in my target ability range. And then the other way that we need these proficiency scales is because it facilitates communications across programs and organizations. We need some kind of common language for describing different levels of ability. And this can help with things like placement into language programs from different schools or programs or countries. It can help with credentialing people to say, hey, we need someone in this position who has this ability of language. And just saying that they're good or they're fluent or they're proficient, those are relative terms. So we need some kind of proficiency descriptor that is more explicit about what it is actually that that person can do. And we'll find out as we talk about these scales, all of them were developed for those kinds of purposes. So first, let's talk about the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, often just referred to as the CEFR. The CEFR was developed in Europe to help describe language ability across different countries within the European Union. So if someone's learning language at one school and then wants to go to another school, there wanted a way to be able to tell what that student's ability was and to find an appropriate class that matched it. Or sometimes finding an appropriate job. They could say, hey, we need an accountant in our company who is proficient in this language at this particular level. And so that's the background in creating the Common European Framework of Reference. And it has sort of three main categories, the A, the B, and the C category. And each of those three stages is broken down into two parts. So we have A1 and A2, which is sometimes described as beginner stages, B1 and B2, which is intermediate, and C1 and C2, which is sometimes described as advanced. At the A1 level, we have people who are just new beginners of the language and can do kind of rudimentary, basic kind of interactions. Intermediate is where we start getting more advanced, more independent kind of language use. Less dependence on teachers and memorized language. And the advanced stage, the C1 and C2, is really highly educated, proficient users of the language. I thought this diagram might be interesting to show. This is a Sephar Scale used in government policy within the country of Malaysia. And what Malaysia wants to do is that by the year 2025, they want their English teachers to have these levels of proficiency depending on what types of English classes the teachers are teaching. So if you want to be a preschool English teacher in Malaysia, you're going to need to have A1 proficiency. If you want to teach in elementary, primary schools, you're going to have A2 proficiency. Those who teach in high school are going to need the B1 proficiency, and college and university, you've got to be B2 or higher. And so the goal is to help their English language teachers reach these levels. So here's an example where you can see the CEFR is being used to describe job descriptions and what is needed to qualify for different jobs. Here's our next scale. This is the American Council for Teaching of Foreign Languages, or ACTFL. It's their proficiency guidelines. They use this inverted pyramid cone to help describe their scale. And their scale has four, maybe we can think of 5 parts. The bottom is the novice ability, green is the intermediate, then we have orange, it's advanced, and then we have yellow, superior. They've also added on in the last decade or so the distinguished level, which is that white at the top. They use this pyramid to try and show that the amount of language and the types of tasks that someone can do grows immensely as they progress up the level. So a novice learner is very limited in what they can do, but as they go higher and higher up, the person has a lot more that they can do with the language. And so that's the reason for this visual that they've used. Each of their stages, from novice to advanced, are also broken down into 3 stages. So they have the low, mid, and high for each of the novice, intermediate, and advanced stages. They don't make that distinction at the superior or distinguished level. Where did ACTFL come from? Well, ACTFL actually comes from the ILR, which is the Interagency Language Roundtable, which was developed by the U.S. government. The U.S. government needed a way to be able to describe language ability for government positions and jobs, including things like CIA and spies, but also other types of diplomats and State Department. And so they developed this scale that went from 0 to 5 back in the 1950s, and when ACTFL wanted to develop the scale, they based it off of the ILR descriptors. And so novice that we saw is equal to the 0 level. This is really kind of a parrot kind of language. You can only repeat things that you've memorized. Then we have intermediate, it's level 1. This is kind of basic survival intercommunication. And then advanced, we're getting the ability to be much more independent and creative with language, deal with problems. That's level 2 at the ILR. And then ACTFL just used superior to describe anything above level 2, so 3, 4, and 5. Since then, ACTFL has broken down superior to be closer to level 3, and then distinguished to be level 4. They don't even have something for level 5. Level 5 is really high-level SPY language, the ability to use lots of different forms of the same language, accents, understanding it at a highly educated level, but also all the different variations of a language that exist within a community in a country. So here is a diagram that tries to align ACTFL with the Interagency Language Roundtable and the CEFR. And so we can see that the A1 level at CEFR, that's the 0 in the US government, and that's the novice level in ACTFL. As you go to A2, we get level 1, and then we have sort of the intermediate. B1 is still in level 1 and still intermediate. By the time we get to B2, we're getting to level 2 and the advanced range. And then the C1 and C2, this is really high level, highly educated, university graduated, highly educated native speaker. Not all native speakers even get to this level in their own native language. But we can see that those are really high levels for the C1 and C2. Most people are functioning in the A1 and the A2 language groups. I have a friend in the Navy who is a linguist, and he just recently reached the 3 level in Chinese, and he's been studying really hard at that. That's quite a big accomplishment to get into that 3 range. I worked for a government contractor that developed language tests for U.S. military of less commonly taught languages throughout Asia and Africa and even some parts of Europe. And we usually just dealt with the 1, the 0, the 1, and sometimes with the 1+ range, because those languages are just so rarely taught. And their target is just to get military personnel into the A1, A2, and the B1 ranges. Here's the 3rd scale, Canadian Language Benchmarks. This system uses 3 stages, stage 1, 2, and 3, and each stage has 4 levels within it. And they have descriptors for what learners can do at the listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills. It's quite a complex scale, but this scale was developed primarily to help immigrants to Canada develop English or French proficiency. And so they wanted to provide teachers and government agencies with the ability to understand what can learners of the language do, and what do they need to do to be successful in different parts of their life. What's great about the Canadian language benchmarks that we use here at SUU, we use them particularly with our community ESL program that's for our immigrants. And I like this program because it is written very much learner focused. It has descriptors of what a learner can do at each language that is described in a way that learners can understand. It's not in highly academic or difficult languages. There's lots of good images and example phrases and situations where learners would use the type of language at these different scales. So it's very learner friendly, very immigrant focused, but very helpful. Here is a study, or a table from the results of a study by ACTFL, where they tried to align the Canadian language benchmarks with the ACTFL scale and the CEFR. And what we can see here is that novice language is the A1 level, or Canadian language benchmarks 1 and 2. As we get into the intermediate, we're getting into the A2, okay? And then as we get to closer to advanced, we're getting towards B1. And then really deep and advanced is B2, and then really getting into C1 or C2, that's the superior and distinguished level. And again, those are things that we're not likely to teach. Most language teaching happens in the A1, A2, maybe the B1 level. So most TESOL teachers are going to be working with novice and intermediate learners. Here at SUU, our intensive English language program takes students from novice, and we hope that by the time they complete our program at level 6, that they've reached the advanced low range. So why did we talk about all this? Just as a reminder, having common descriptors for talking about language proficiency helps teachers know what skills to target. It helps students know what they need to do to advance their proficiency, and it helps have this common language for describing language proficiency for schooling, for employment, and for other purposes.